Chapter 20. There was a new urgency in Selethen's manner as the outriders closed in response to his signal. He looked around the foreigners, ensuring they were all wearing the keffiyehs he had given them when they set out from Al-Shabar. These were desert headdresses, essentially a simple square of cotton folded into a triangle, then draped over the head so that elongated tails hung down either side and at the back, providing protection from the sun. They were held in place by a twisted coil of camel hair rope. Now he quickly showed them how the elongated tails could be pulled across the face, then quickly twisted over each other to cover the nose and mouth of the wearer. It was a simple but effective form of head protection in the desert. "You'll need them," he said. "Once the sand wall hits us, you'll be unable to breathe without them." Will glanced to the south. The thin, dark line he had noticed a few minutes ago was now a thick band that spread from one side of the horizon to the other. In fact, he realized, the horizon seemed to have moved closer. He glanced north to confirm the fact. The sandstorm was blotting out the horizon to the south. It was a dirty brown color at the base, almost black. And now he could see that it towered thousands of meters into the air, blocking out the sky. The storm itself was rapidly becoming the boundary of their world. Selethen stood in his stirrups, looking for any available shelter. "There," he called, "there's a shallow wadi. The bank will give us a little protection." He urged his horse towards the wadi, a dry gully that cut through the hard rocky ground. The walls were barely 3 meters in height, but they would offer some protection at least. They hurried to follow him. He halted a few meters short of the edge to allow them to pass by. "My God," said Horace, "look at how fast it's moving." They looked up. The dirty brown wall of swirling sand now completely blocked their sight to the south. There was nothing but the storm, and now they could see how quickly it was advancing on them. It was moving like the wind, Will thought. Then he realized it was the wind. He glanced up and caught Evelyn's eyes on him. They exchanged a worried look, and he knew they were both thinking the same thing. The massive storm that had swept down on them when they were prisoners on Wolfwind years before. He tried to grin reassuringly at her, but at that moment the first breath of the storm struck them, unbelievably hot and fetid and laden with flying, invisible grains of sand. Tug plunged nervously as the sand whipped at his face and flanks. Will kept a firm hand on the reins. Usually, Tug only needed him to hold them lightly, but in these conditions, he knew, his horse would respond better to the sense of control that a firm pressure on the bit would impart to him. "Take it easy, boy," he said. "It's just sand." The wind was now a living presence around them, keening horribly. And the light was dying. Will was startled to find that Evelyn, less than 5 meters away, was now a shadowy, indistinct form in the dimness. The others were no clearer. Selethen rode in among them, and they pressed closer to him to hear him, horses tossing and whinnying nervously. He unwound the protective keffiyeh from his mouth and shouted his instructions. "Ride down into the wadi. Dismount and turn your horses' tails to the wind. Try to cover their heads with your cloaks if you can. Then we'll—" Whatever he was going to add was lost in a giant fit of coughing as he drew in a mouthful of fine flying sand. He doubled over, pulling his headdress across his face again and waving them towards the wadi. Holt led the way. Will's sense of panic rose as he realized that his mentor would be out of sight in a few meters if he didn't hurry to follow him. He was conscious of other blurred figures close to him as Gillen, Horace, Evelyn, and Svengal all followed suit. Further away, there were vague forms moving in the storm, and he realized these were the Aridi troops moving to the shelter. The dim shadow that was Holt and Abelard seemed to sink into the ground, and he realized that they must have reached the rim of the Wadi. Tug, seeing them disappear, became nervous, sensing that the ground before him was unsafe. He whinnied shrilly and balked, resisting Will's efforts to urge him forward. The wind was screaming around them, terrifying in its intensity and power, disorienting the little horse. Never before had Tug refused Will's command, but now he stood his ground. The wind prevented his hearing the reassuring tones of his trusted master's voice, and he sensed danger somewhere ahead. He had seen Holt and Abelard disappear, and he was trained to protect his master in situations like this. He braced his forelegs and stood fast, head down into the screaming, flaying wind. Will saw the shadowy figure of Horace move past him, recognizable only because of the fact that Kicker stood hands taller than Tug. Someone else moved past him too. He had no idea who it was. Conditions were getting worse, as unbelievable as that might seem. The wind was like the blast from an oven, the air superheated, and the millions of flying, stinging sand particles tore at any piece of exposed skin. The grains forced their way into clothing, under the face masks of the keffiyers, into boots, inside collars, and into any crevice in the skin. Eyelids, ears, nostrils were full of it, and Will coughed rackingly. He found the action of coughing caused him to inhale more sand than he expelled, but it was unavoidable. He couldn't stay here like this, he realized, and he couldn't leave Tug. He would have to dismount and lead the little horse, hoping that the sight of his master in front of him would calm his fears enough for him to move. He took a firm grip on the reins and swung down to the ground. Ordinarily, he would have trusted Tug to stand still when he dismounted, but he knew the little horse was close to panic in this screaming, hellish, sand-laden wind. He slipped his right arm up under Tug's neck, caressing him and speaking to him, all the time keeping a firm hold on the reins with his other hand. It seemed to be working. Tug's braced forefeet relaxed, and he allowed himself to take a faltering few steps in response to Will's urging. "Come on, boy. It's all right. It's only sand." He tried to croon the words reassuringly, but he was startled by the sound of his own voice, which came out as a dry, faltering croak. He doubted the horse could hear him, but he felt that the contact of his right arm and the proximity of his body was keeping the little horse under control. He stooped as he led Tug forward, trying to see the point where the ground dropped away into the Wadi. It was all he could do to make out the ground itself amid the flying debris of the storm. He glanced up at Tug's face once. The little horse's eyes were tight shut against the wind. Fine sand and dust had crusted over the moisture around the eye sockets and lids. Where the hell was that bank? He stumbled forward, awkward with the resistant weight of Tug's reluctant body. He pulled the reins firmly, and the horse yielded a little, taking 3 more hesitant steps forward. He realized that Tug's instinct was to turn tail onto the wind, protecting his eyes and nostrils from the whipping sand. But he had to keep forcing the little horse forward to the meagre shelter offered by the Wadi's banks. He had a sense that the storm had not yet reached its peak. Sand whipped across his eyes, blinding him, and he released his hold around Tug's neck for a moment to try to wipe them clear. It was a futile effort. He gasped and spluttered, blinded and suffocated by the storm. He pulled on the reins once more and stepped forward, head bowed against the screaming darkness around him. He felt his foot fall into empty space. Off balance, he teetered on the brink of the Wadi bank, flailing his free arm into the air to try to regain his stance. His whirling arm struck Tug across the nose, and the little horse reared back in surprise and alarm, unsighted by the cloying sand around his eyes, and not seeing where the blow had come from. Will began to fall and desperately threw himself back from the Wadi's edge. The reins came loose from his grip as Tug jerked away, terrified by the thundering noise of the wind, startled by the sudden, unexpected blow across his muzzle, and panic-stricken by the loss of contact with his master. Blinded by the sand, he wheeled instinctively away from the wind, seeking for some sense of will in the storm close by him. But his senses, normally so keen and finely honed, were deadened by the all-pervading scream of the storm, the heat and the whipping flying sand. Still trying to make some contact with Will, he took a pace, then another, whinnying shrilly in alarm, but he was already heading in the wrong direction. Will floundered to his feet. He tried to call to his horse, but his voice was barely a croak now. He thought he could sense a presence in the storm a few meters away. He stumbled towards it, knowing it was Tug. But the vague shape, nothing more than a half-perceived denser mass in the darkness surrounding him, moved away, and he lost sight of it. He stumbled forward, the wind behind him now. "Tug!" he tried to shout, but the sound was inaudible even to his own ears, drowned by the triumphant shriek of the massive wind. He stretched out a hand, but touched nothing but flying sand. Then, miraculously, he saw a shadow looming out of the dark mass of wind and sand and debris. "Tug!" he gasped, but a hand grabbed the collar of his cloak and pulled him forward. Dimly, he realized that he was face to face with Selethen. "Get down!" the Wakir shouted at him, dragging him towards the rough ground. Will fought against the iron grip. "Horse!" he managed to force the word out. "My horse!" "Leave him!" Selethen spoke slowly and deliberately, so that he could be heard above the storm. Now he was urging his own horse, trained for and accustomed to these conditions, to its knees, all the time holding Will's collar with his free hand. The Aridi horse lay on its side, head curled around into the shelter of its own body. Will felt a foot slip between his feet to trip him, and he and Selethen crashed to the ground together, the Aridi dragging him into the scant shelter provided by the horse's body. "Tug!" Will screamed, the effort searing his parched throat with agony. Selethen was fumbling with his cloak, trying to drag it over both their heads to protect them from the sand. He leaned over to speak directly into Will's ear. "You'll die out there," he shouted. "You'll never find him now. Try to do it and you'll die. He's gone, understand?" Dully, Will realized that he was right. He would have no chance of finding his horse in the blinding, whirling mass of sand that surrounded them. He felt a great stab of pain in his heart at the thought of his horse, alone and terrified in all that horror, and he sobbed uncontrollably, great racking sobs that heaved and shuddered through his entire body. But there were no tears. The heat and the choking, cloying sand and dust denied him even that small comfort.